Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about the UBE versus California bar exams and how to decide which one makes the most sense for you. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app, and you can also check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about the UBE versus California bar exams and how to decide which makes sense for you. So before we kind of dig into this decision, it probably makes sense to do a quick recap of what each exam actually consists of. So, what's the difference?
Right. I think that's a good idea. And also, what even is the UBE?
Oh,
what does that even stand for?
Okay. Well, that's the Uniform Bar Exam, and it is administered by the National Conference of Bar Examiners, the NCBE, and they've kind of created this, uniform exam that can be used by multiple states all around the country to try and kind of standardize this process and then make it easier to move within certain jurisdictions. So a lot of jurisdictions, I think it's 20 something now, all have adopted fully the UBE, including New York, which I think was a big tipping point for a lot of jurisdictions. But once you have this UBE exam, you can then take it on the road and see if you qualify to get licensed in other states. So that's really what the UBE is. And then we can kind of dive into what it covers. So both the UBE and the California bar exam use the multiple choice portion of the bar, which is part of the UBE. That's the second day. It's called the MBE. And that covers these core 7 topics of con law, contract, civ pro, criminal law and procedure, evidence, real property, and torts. So if you're studying for California or the UBE, you got to know all that stuff because it's going to show up possibly on the essays, but definitely on the multiple choice. Then where it gets a little trickier is when you get to the essays. So the UBE has subject essays called the MEE, the multi-state essay exam. And it covers, in addition to the big 7 that's used for the MBE, business associations, conflicts of law, family law, trust and estates, secured transactions. So these are 6 30-minute essays that can cover the 7 MBE topics or these additional topics. And then once you're done with all of that, then you get to do 2 90-minute performance tests. So much fun. People are like, sign me up.
Sign me up. I want to do that for several days of my life. Why not?
I know. Why not? Right? Now, California, the second day is the same. You take the MBE, you take that 6 hours of multiple choice, but the first day is different.
Fun.
So California, I know we have to be unique in California. Well, it used to be 3 days back in the day when we took it. Now it's just 2. So the first writing day in California is 5 60-minute essays and 1 90-minute performance test. So again, the UBE has 30-minute essays. California has 60-minute essays. And in addition to the 7 topics that everybody tests on, California adds business associations, community property, professional responsibility, both the ABA and California rules, remedies, trusts, wills, California civil procedure, California evidence. That seems like a longer list than the last one I did.
It does.
It does. A lot of things that had the word California in them, which is a little stressful. So again, all of that stuff can be tested on 5 60-minute essays, and then you get a 1 90-minute performance test that is written by California, but is pretty much indistinguishable from the performance test used on the UBE. I know everybody's running out. Let's go sign up for the bar right now. It sounds so much fun. So when people talk to us, they often ask, like, which test is harder? Like, what's their highest likelihood for becoming a lawyer, basically?
Right. I love that question.
I know. So what do you think is the answer to this question, or how should people think about this question?
Well, I mean, I think traditionally people have seen California as harder because the pass rate is lower overall. But that being said, I think you have to dig into those numbers a little bit. You know, California lets a lot of people sit for the bar who would not be allowed to sit in other states. So in terms of the exam itself, I think the exams are different. I'm not sure that one is inherently harder than the other. I mean, one day is completely the same. With the essays, I think it actually depends. So in some ways, even though the shorter 30-minute essays seem like they might be easier, I think in some ways they're not necessarily, because they're more focused. And so in California, if you get a 60-minute essay and it's maybe not on your strongest topic, but you have a general, you've studied this, like you know something about the area. You probably have a little more leeway to kind of use the facts to shape your answer and argue both sides. Whereas with one of the UBE essays, if they're testing like a pretty specific area of the law, which they are, and you don't remember those rules, you're kind of dead in the water.
That is true. They really focus on precision.
Right. I mean, you have to know, what it is that they're testing. And if you forget that rule or you didn't study that thing, you're going to have a really hard time. I think the timing on both of them can obviously be a real challenge. In some ways, again, I think the 30-minute essays of the UBE can actually be more challenging just because they're so short. If you're giving yourself an extra couple of minutes on the first 5 essays, well, now you've got a real problem because you've got half the time on the final essay. I mean, I think if you're inherently kind of good at the performance test, I think the UBE has an advantage because you get to do 2 of them. So, I think people, often think the UBE is easier. And the thing with the UBE too is a lot of it comes down to the actual score that you need in a certain state. So that varies. Some states are, upwards of 20 points more that you need. So obviously it's going to be much harder to pass in a state that has a higher pass score. So I don't know that one, I mean, as you pointed out earlier, California does have these additional topics. It has the California specific versions of things. So I think that can be challenging, particularly if people did not go to school in California. So I think it really just kind of depends, I think. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I've been talking to a lot of people recently who are coming to prepare for California from out of state. And I think that one thing that can happen to folks who are coming to sit for California is they don't fully appreciate the amount of substantive law that they need to learn that is California specific. If you went to school in California, some of this stuff is taught in California law schools, depending on your school. But if you're coming from back east, nobody was talking to you about community property, probably in any of your classes. And that doesn't mean that it's prohibitive of being able to pass. Plenty of people come to California and pass from out of state. But I do think that it's an additional layer of studying that needs to be done because you are, you're not just doing maybe the classes you didn't take. So let's say you didn't take wills and trusts in school, but you're also learning the California distinctions for evidence and California civil procedure, California professional responsibility. It's not that this stuff isn't learnable. It totally is, but it's just going to take some time to feel confident about it.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised by that when I came and sat in California, which was my second exam. And I remember thinking, like, on the exam, I think I had an evidence question and they were asking for like the California and the federal rules. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I did not really keep these straight. Like I kind of knew what the 2 rules were, but I definitely did not know which one belonged to California and which one belonged to the federal rules of evidence. So yeah, I mean, I think you've got to kind of focus on that and pay attention to that because I mean, they're going to test some type of California distinctions, I would say, on almost every California bar, if not every single one.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they're not going to let you at this point get a California license without testing you on some California law. And they can
Right.
only do that on the essays. So
Right. Like, what would be the point?
Why have them write their own test? Yeah, exactly. I mean, so it's going to be on there. It's probably going to be community property or wills or trusts, at least, if not additional subjects. But you're going to see something California specific on there that you're going to be required to regurgitate.
Yeah, I didn't mind community property because I thought that was one of those like interesting life subjects. But when you get into the details of like California this and California that on topics that I'd already studied, I was just like, this is just not something I want to be doing. But you kind of have to.
Yeah, those California evidence distinctions can really make your head spin a bit. They really can. They're very close to the federal rules of evidence, which makes it difficult to memorize them. It's like it's too close for comfort almost, but it is its own project, and you just have to be willing to take that on. One thing I do think that individuals need to think about too is if you are just looking for a law license somewhere, let's say you want to work in the federal government, let's say you want to work in-house or do something that may not require a local jurisdiction bar license, it may behoove you, even if you're coming to California, unless you think that you're going to want to, practice California law, to practice or to take the jurisdiction that is going to give you the highest likelihood of passing. That's another way to approach it. So you do want to realize that not all jobs in all states require you to be licensed in that individual state.
Right. I remember when I was looking at where to take the exam, and this was kind of pre-UBE days, and I was debating New York, California. I couldn't decide. And then the judge I was working for in Boston said, why don't you do Massachusetts? And I said, well, I don't really think that I want to stay here long term. It's too cold. He said, yeah, but there's a 90% pass rate and you should just get admitted someplace. And I was like, that's not a bad argument. And I went and signed up for it that day because his point was like, look, you're going to be working in a large law firm. Basically, you can be admitted, your cases are going to be all over the place anyway. So you're just going to be admitted pro hoc vice, wherever you are. And that was absolutely correct because I ended up doing patent litigation, and all of those cases were either in Delaware or in Texas, where basically no one was admitted in the firm. So his point was you can just get the license, and then if you end up deciding to move back to one of these places, then you deal with it then. And I thought that was pretty good advice, and I think it applies even more in the UBE days, because if you get a high enough portable score, that's opened up a lot of options for you. So I think in some ways, California should kind of be like your worst case option. Like, you definitely are going to be living in California and you need to be licensed there. The pro of taking California is you get to practice in California, but the pro of the UBE is kind of everything else.
Yeah. And we're not really talking about Florida because they're their own, like Florida and Louisiana are kind of their own thing, but the same thing there. I mean, don't go sit for the Florida bar unless you're planning on practicing law in Florida and you need a Florida law license, because you can't do anything with that law license when you take it on the road. It's really its own thing. So you want to be thoughtful if you're going to go to these states where you're studying for something very specific, that there's a good reason for you to be there.
Right. I think the default option at this point really should be, can you take the UBE? And if not, then you take something else. But if you can take the UBE, just go ahead, study for it, get a high enough score that you're going to be able to use it across the country. And then you've just opened up a lot of options for yourself.
Yeah. I think some other pros of the UBE are that the performance test is a larger portion than the California bar. And we've talked about on this podcast why we love the performance test so much, because you do not need to know any law to be successful on it. And that can be great. You can start studying early. Maybe you're a really good writer. This is just a part of the exam that can be an easy way to boost your score. And especially, let's say, if you have been away from school for a bit, it can be nice to be able to study for this portion of the test that's less about the substantive law. So that's another benefit the UBE has, is that they give more weight to the performance test.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, too, one thing to consider if you need accommodations is there may be more flexible options in different places. So in a lot of states, you can actually sit even if you don't intend to necessarily be licensed there. You obviously want to check into this, but certain states do let you just sit for their exam, and they may be more flexible on accommodations than certain other places. So this is definitely something to consider and to look into really early. Because some of the UBE states are notoriously a little challenging in terms of both giving accommodations
New
and
York.
and the process for appeal, New York. So you might be able to play it to your advantage by going someplace else, getting that score, and then it doesn't matter. Whereas if you're just in California or just in Florida or whatever, you're going to be stuck with whatever answer they give you.
Yep. And I think that for the California bar, the big pro is, you get to practice in California if you want to work. Woohoo! If you want to work in a job that needs a California license, at least California is a big state and you can move around a lot without leaving the state. So it's not necessarily like you have to stay in one major metropolitan area. You do have options between, all the various parts of California, but you are going to want to have a reason to be here. But if you want the law license, go ahead and go get it. And taking it as an attorney applicant, which some people do talk about. So California has this option where if you've been practicing 5 years somewhere else, you can come and just take the writing portion of the test, which is a single day test. And I have heard folks say, oh, well, I'm just going to do that because, then I'll have my UBE. And then if I want to come back someday in California, I can still, I can take the attorney's exam. But the pass rate for the attorney's exam is really low, which is something you need to be aware of because it's usually people are studying for it while working. You've been out of school for at least 5 years, so you've been away from this law for a very long time. Some people actually get their scores pulled up by the MBE, and that's not part of the test, although you could opt to take that part of the test, but that's a whole nother thing you have to study. And when you've been practicing, you don't write in this more academic style, which is what the bar review or what the bar examiners are looking for. So it can be kind of tricky to come sit for the attorney's exam. So it sounds great in theory. You're like, well, I'll just come back and do it once I'm licensed somewhere else. But it's not as much of a piece of cake as it might sound like on first blush.
Right. I mean, I think there's probably an argument if you do think that your life path is eventually, say that you're clerking someplace, so you've got a clerkship or two, or, you're in big law in some place you probably don't want to live permanently. You do want to come back to San Diego or San Francisco or LA or whatever. I think there's a pretty strong argument for almost doing them back to back, so you take one when you graduate. And then, you probably take the UBE when you graduate, assuming you pass that. You then sit either, the next time around or a year from then or whenever, but fairly soon for California because you've already been studying a lot of this stuff. So, the MBE material would still be fresh. I think there's an argument for just kind of trying to get them both done, assuming you pass the first time on the first one you take.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other open question here is, will California eventually just move to the UBE and maybe you can wait around and see if that happens? What do you think on that?
I mean, who knows?
Right?
I don't know. That's like the $1 million question. They're going to redo the UBE at some point, maybe 4 or 5 years down the road. And I don't think it's 100% clear what that will be. I mean,
right.
Sure, in theory, I think some point California will be worn down, but I doubt that it's going to happen before they release whatever this new version of the bar exam is coming from the NCBE, whatever that ends up looking like when it gets here.
The next generation
so
bar
I think
exam.
The next generation bar exam. Thank you, and make sure I call it. It's like so Star Trekky. It's like
I know.
bar exam, the next generation.
Bar exam, next gen.
At 6:00 on channel 24. So, I mean, I think that's probably like at some point in our careers, we will see that happen, but they're going to get a ton of pushback from practicing lawyers. It's not going to be a simple move. So I wouldn't hold your breath. I think if you're listening to this podcast, it's probably not going to happen while you're trying to get licensed. That would be my guess.
Right. Yeah, and I think the other thing to consider is that your UBE score doesn't generally last forever. So there's generally a time frame of, you have 5 years to go get admitted somewhere else. So do we see California moving to the UBE and accepting those scores in the next 5 years from July? I'm going to say probably not. I mean, could happen. But I'm going to say maybe 10 to 20% likelihood. 10 years from now, I would say probably.
I don't think. I would agree with that. But 5 years, I don't think so.
Yeah. So I think you're going to be stuck taking 2 exams.
But I mean, who knows?
Who knows? It could happen tomorrow.
Yep, I think you are. Who knows? I mean, it's been a weird few years.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about how you prepare for each. So it is important to recognize if you're moving between these 2 exams. So let's say you decide to take one and then you're going to take the other. You've got to make sure that you understand not only what subjects are tested, but what is heavily tested. Because as we mentioned in California specifically, some of this California specific law is super heavily tested. So you can't just wing it with what you know of kind of the national or the more common law that's tested on the UBE. So you really want to make sure that you understand what's heavily tested. That can be done using, outlines like Smart Bar Prep that do a good job of highlighting heavily tested areas. Our Brainy Bar Bank tool helps you see what's the most heavily tested in each, not only which subjects are the most heavily tested, but which topics within that subject, so you can do very targeted practice. But you've really got to understand what are you the most likely to see, because it's not always what you think. I mean, the UBE, they test Civ Pro and secure transactions really heavily. That would not be my first 2 choices of what you would see a lot on that test. But it comes up all the time.
Because no one took secured.
No, I didn't take secure transactions
in law school.
Nobody took secure transactions.
I mean, I don't think it is a class.
I don't even know if it is. So it's really important to understand what's really likely to show up. And then as we've talked about in California, you've got all these sneaky California distinctions. So make sure you understand which of those subjects, especially if you're self-studying and not using a full bar prep program, make sure you clearly understand what California distinctions are going to be on those essays, and make sure that you do practice on the distinctions. You need to do evidence questions applying California law, and you can always take an evidence question that did apply federal law and apply California law instead if you need more practice, but you definitely have to make sure that you understand what California law can be tested.
Right. And I think this is also a place where you want to think about it as you're studying. And maybe have a chart with, different color coding, for example, of California versus federal rules on things. So California is always red and the federal is always black. So something like that, if you do it consistently, then you can review those. And then hopefully in your head, you start to literally see it as oh, that was red. Oh, great. Okay, I know that's the California rule. So, I think something you can do basically from the start is really think about how you're going to manage these distinctions so that you are not having to scramble at the last second to try to remember what they are.
Yes. Also, for both bars, you're going to have to manage your time. 30 minutes, super fast. 60 minutes also feels super fast. 90 minutes also feels super fast. 3 hours for multiple choice questions. Turns out that feels super fast too. So you have to do timed practice under exam conditions so you can really make sure that you understand kind of the cadence that you need to be working at. And if you're switching, if you've sat for California and you're moving to the UBE, or you sat for the UBE and you're moving to California, you really need to get comfortable with this different time frame that you have to work in, because 30 minutes is going to feel I realize it's half as fast, but it's going to feel so much significantly faster. 30 minutes goes by in a flash under exam conditions, and you really have to get used to that. It does. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, you only have 3 minutes to 5 minutes to plan. I mean, it's very fast. You have to work very fast.
Yeah. Right. I think also doing those 6 essays back to back can be a real challenge. And then in California, you've got this weird afternoon situation where you do 2 substantive essays and the PT. And I think that can really mess up people's timing. It's a longer session. And then also, sometimes people want to steal time from the PT or give time to the PT. And, none of these are really great. You kind of need to stay on time. But you definitely want to practice also that switch mentally from doing those 2 substantive essays to doing a PT. Which one are you going to do first? All these kind of things are things you want to have actually thought about and practiced.
Yeah. So, really my final thoughts on this are just really understand the choices that you're making. Make thoughtful choices about how you prepare. So make sure, you understand if you're doing California, make sure you have California specific materials or using a bar review provider that gives you California-specific materials. Make sure that you carve out some extra time for the additional substantive law that you may learn. Just really make sure that as you set up your study plan, you're just being thoughtful about the whole thing, that you really understand the test that you're studying for, whichever test that may be, and that you've got a plan to get yourself prepared with lots of time to practice under exam conditions, and then you're going to feel ready. But you just want to be very thoughtful. I think a lot of times people just check a box and say, well, I guess I'll take this bar, and then they don't really understand what they're getting into.
Right. And I think it's also really critical to understand the different types of writing that these two exams are looking for in the substantive law. And, a lot of this comes down to the 30 versus 60 minutes. But California is looking for deeper analysis. And if you try to do that type of analysis on the UBE, you're going to run out of time. If you don't do it in California, you're probably going to fail. So I think you've got to look at actual sample answers. In California, you can get the answer, the two best answers. You've also got the bar essays. The UBE is actually weirdly harder to get sample answers for, because what they publish from the NCBE is actually not really a sample answer. It's kind of a written analysis of what your answer might talk about. And so, I think if you are doing the UBE, you want to make sure you have actual sample answers to look at, because otherwise you don't know kind of what you're trying to write. And I think that's so key when you have these short essays, is it needs to look a certain way. It needs to kind of flow a certain way. And if you don't know what that looks like, that's going to be problematic.
And in our Writing of the Week program, we did draft sample answers, because that was one of the things students were really craving, was some sort of crafted answer. Now, our answers were not written under time conditions, full disclosure, because they were written by tutors and they were double checked and edited, but they're still going to give you a good idea of the type of answer to strive for and what needs to be included in it, especially for the UBE, where they give you these very strange score sheets that have a lot of information in it that you would never include. It's an odd choice. It's an odd choice.
Now, I remember when we were drafting those answers, and the tutors were, we asked them to just, spend about 30 minutes writing your answer. Obviously you can spend a little bit more. And we kind of got this feedback of, wow, this is really hard.
Yeah, they're we haven't done this in a while. And then every now and then we'll have a tutor on our team
your pain.
Yes. And every now and then we'll have a tutor on our team who's going to sit for a bar somewhere. Every few years we have somebody who's moved or something. And then we get to watch them study for a new bar. And then we get the feedback of oh yeah, I was drilling these rules that I know and, kind of loosely, but you have to know them really solid to be able to do this under the time conditions with closed book, questions. Even for people who do this stuff as part of their job, you still have to brush up your skills in order to perform at your best. So this stuff isn't easy.
Right. And I think also taking the full-time test, the first time even a tutor who's studying this stuff all the time kind of sits down and does that 6 hours of MBE questions is oh, wow, that was really exhausting. So I think what you can take away is the more stuff you can do under time conditions and exam conditions, really just the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or Alison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.